The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan overhead. I sat cross-legged on the edge of my bed, an old wooden box resting on my lap. My fingers brushed over the intricate carvings on its lid, the weight of the moment heavy in my chest. Inside the box were fragments of a life I had long since tucked away. Letters, photographs, and little mementos that once held meaning, but now felt like relics from another world. I hadn't opened it in years, but something about tonight had driven me to pull it out from the back of my closet. I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. The familiar scent of aged paper wafted up, and my chest tightened as I reached for the first letter. Bill's handwriting stared back at me, the lines neat and deliberate, each word a reminder of the love we had shared. Evelyn, my beautiful Evelyn. I stopped reading, the lump in my throat making it impossible to continue. I didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway, didn't register the faint creak of the door until it was too late. Evelyn? My heart jumped, and I scrambled to close the box, nearly dropping it in the process. Andrew stood in the doorway, his hand still on the doorknob, his expression caught somewhere between curiosity and concern. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the box in my lap. I didn't mean to barge in. The door was open. I forced a smile, though my hands trembled as I clutched the box. It's fine, I just wasn't expecting anyone. Andrew stepped inside, his movements slow and cautious. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said quickly, too quickly. Just going through some old things. His gaze lingered on me for a moment before shifting to the box. What's in there? Nothing, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Just memories. He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he moved to sit on the edge of the bed, his presence filling the room in a way that made my chest tighten. I didn't mean to interrupt, he said softly. You didn't, I lied, my hands gripping the edges of the box as if it might anchor me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, until Andrew finally broke it. Do you ever miss him? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard, and I felt my throat tighten. Every day, I admitted. He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. Me too. There was something about the way he said it, the quiet vulnerability in his voice, that made my heart ache. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing against his arm. He was proud of you, you know, I said softly. He always said you were going to do great things. Andrew looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. And you? He asked. What do you think? The question hung in the air, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I think he was right, I said finally. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and for a moment the tension in the room eased. But it was still there, simmering beneath the surface, an unspoken weight that neither of us seemed ready to confront. When Andrew finally stood to leave, the room felt colder without him. I'll let you get back to whatever that is, he said, gesturing toward the box. Thank you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame. Evelyn? Yes? If you ever need to talk about anything, I'm here. I nodded, my chest tightening as I watched him leave. I know. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet of my bedroom, the box still resting on my lap, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Andrew had always been kind, always attentive. But tonight, there had been something different in his gaze, something unspoken but undeniable. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to ignore it. The morning after Andrew walked in on me, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me before leaving. His words had been simple, almost casual, but there had been something beneath them, a kind of unspoken understanding that lingered long after he'd gone. I told myself I was overthinking it. Andrew was just being kind, the way he always was. But as I stood in the kitchen making coffee, I couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, the quiet intensity in them, that had left me feeling exposed in a way I hadn't expected. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced out the window to see Andrew's truck parked in front of the house. What now? I muttered under my breath, though my heart quickened as I wiped my hands on a dish towel and moved to open the door. Andrew stood on the porch, holding a brown paper bag in one hand and a confident grin on his face. Morning, he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Morning, I replied, crossing my arms. What are you doing here? Thought I'd bring breakfast, he said, holding up the bag. Figured you might not have eaten yet. I raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, stepping aside to let him into the kitchen. He set the bag down on the counter and started unpacking its contents: croissants, fruit, and 2 steaming cups of coffee. You didn't have to do this, I said, though I couldn't deny the warmth spreading through my chest at the gesture. I wanted to, he replied simply, handing me a coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the morning light streaming through the windows. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, but his eyes held that same quiet intensity from the night before. So, what were you really doing with that box? He asked, his tone casual but curious. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my coffee cup. Just reminiscing, I said finally. About Dad? Yes, I admitted. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. You don't talk about him much. It's not easy, I said softly. There are days when it still feels like he's just out running an errand and will walk through the door any minute. Andrew reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through me. You don't have to go through this alone, you know, he said gently. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of easy conversation and quiet moments. Andrew stayed longer than necessary, helping me clean up the kitchen and fix a squeaky cabinet door that had been bothering me for weeks. At one point, as he knelt to tighten a screw, I reached past him to grab a dish towel from the counter. Our shoulders brushed, and I felt a spark shoot through me, sharp and unexpected. Andrew paused, glancing up at me, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. Sorry, I said quickly, stepping back. It's fine, he replied, though his voice was quieter now, his eyes lingering on mine a second too long before he turned back to the cabinet. Later that afternoon, as I stood by the window watching Andrew's truck disappear down the driveway, I felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Gratitude for his kindness, confusion over the tension that seemed to grow stronger with every visit, and something else, something I wasn't ready to name. That night, I found myself sitting in the living room, a book open on my lap that I wasn't really reading. The house felt quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that pressed down on me like a weight. When my phone buzzed on the coffee table, I picked it up to see Andrew's name on the screen. Andrew. Didn't mean to stay so long today. Hope I didn't get in the way. I stared at the message for a moment before typing a reply. Me, you didn't. It was nice to have company. His response came almost immediately. Andrew, good. Let me know if you ever need anything. Anytime. I set the phone down, my chest tightening at the sincerity in his words. It wasn't just his presence that lingered. It was the way he made me feel, like I wasn't as alone as I had convinced myself I was. And that, more than anything, was what scared me. The next time Andrew stopped by, it was under the guise of fixing a leaky faucet in the bathroom. I knew it didn't really need fixing, but I didn't call him out on it. As he worked, I stood in the doorway, watching him with a mix of curiosity and unease. He moved with the same quiet confidence I had always admired, his focus so intent that he didn't seem to notice me staring. But when he finished and turned to face me, the look in his eyes made my breath catch. All done, he said, his voice soft. Thank you, I replied, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. Andrew stepped closer, his gaze steady on mine. You don't have to thank me, he said. I like being here. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. There was something in his tone, something raw and unguarded, that left me feeling exposed in a way I couldn't explain. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of his words echoed in my mind. I like being here. And for the first time in years, I let myself admit that I liked it too. Over the next week, Andrew's visits became a regular part of my days. He showed up with bags of groceries, tools for fixing things I hadn't even realized were broken, or just himself, and an easy excuse to stay a while. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Andrew had always been attentive, always cared in that easygoing way of his. But the way he lingered now, the way his hand brushed mine when he handed me something, the way his eyes held mine just a little too long, it all felt different. It was in the small moments, the unspoken gestures, that I felt something begin to shift. One afternoon, he showed up with a small bag of flower bulbs. Thought these might look nice by the front steps, he said, holding them up with a grin. I laughed, though the sound felt nervous even to me. Are you taking over my gardening duties now? Just trying to help, he replied, setting the bag down on the porch. Before I could protest, he grabbed a trowel from the shed and began digging a small trench along the edge of the walkway. I stood nearby, watching him work with an efficiency that made me smile despite myself. You didn't have to do this, I said softly. He glanced up at me, his hands covered in dirt, his expression serious. I like helping you, he said simply. The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten, and I looked away, focusing on the flower bulbs in my hands. As we worked side by side, the conversation turned to lighter topics: his work, the weather, a funny story about his neighbor's overly curious dog. But beneath the easy banter, there was a quiet tension I couldn't ignore. At one point, as I leaned forward to hand him a bulb, our hands brushed. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me. I glanced at him, and the look in his eyes made my breath catch. Sorry, he murmured, though he didn't pull away immediately. It's fine, I said quickly, stepping back to put some distance between us. But the moment lingered, the air between us charged with something unspoken. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, we sat together on the porch steps, sipping lemonade and admiring our handiwork. The freshly planted bulbs were neatly arranged, the soil dark and rich against the fading light. Looks good, Andrew said, his voice quiet. It does, I agreed, though my attention was more on him than the flowers. The silence between us stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Evelyn, he said softly, breaking the quiet. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening at the way he was watching me, like he was trying to figure out how to say something he wasn't sure he should. What is it? I asked. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Yes, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. More often than I'd like to admit. He nodded, his jaw tightening. Me too. His honesty made something inside me ache. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing against his arm. You're not alone, I said softly. Andrew looked at me, his eyes filled with something raw and unguarded. Neither are you, he said. The weight of his words hung between us, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The next day, Andrew showed up again, this time with dinner from our favorite Italian place. I figured you shouldn't have to cook tonight, he said, setting the bags down on the counter. I laughed, shaking my head. You're spoiling me. Maybe you deserve to be spoiled, he replied, his tone teasing but his eyes serious. The comment made my cheeks flush, and I turned away, pretending to busy myself with plates and silverware. We ate at the dining room table, the soft glow of the chandelier casting warm shadows on the walls. The conversation was light at first, but as the evening wore on, it turned more introspective. Andrew talked about his father, about how much he missed him, and about the pressure he felt to live up to his expectations. I always thought I had more time with him, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I reached across the table, my hand covering his. He was so proud of you, I said softly. You know that, right? Andrew nodded, his gaze dropping to our joined hands. And what about you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What about me? I asked, confused. Are you proud of me? The vulnerability in his question made my chest tighten, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Of course I am, I said. The look on his face was one of quiet relief, and I realized then how much my opinion mattered to him. After dinner, as we cleaned up the kitchen, the closeness between us felt almost unbearable. Every time he reached past me to grab a plate or a towel, our bodies brushed, and the air between us grew heavier with unspoken tension. At one point, as I reached for a dish on the counter, Andrew's hand covered mine. I froze, my breath catching as I turned to look at him. Evelyn, he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. Yes? He didn't say anything else. Instead, he leaned in, his lips brushing against my cheek in a gesture so brief and tentative that it could almost have been mistaken for an accident. Almost. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine, his expression both apologetic and hopeful. I should go, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though my chest ached at the thought of him leaving. Okay. As he walked to the door, he hesitated, his hand on the knob. "Good night, Evelyn," he said, his voice soft. "Good night," I replied. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt too quiet, too big, and too full of possibilities I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The night after Andrew kissed my cheek, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there in the kitchen. The softness in his voice when he said my name, the hesitation in his eyes before he walked out the door. It wasn't just the kiss, though that alone had left my heart racing. It was everything else. The way he looked at me, the quiet assurance in his presence, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in years. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew better. And that scared me. The next evening, Andrew came by unannounced again. This time, he brought a bottle of wine. "I thought you might need a break," he said, holding it up with a crooked smile. I stared at him for a moment, unsure of what to say. "You really don't take no for an answer, do you?" "Not when it comes to you," he replied, his tone light but his eyes steady. I stepped aside to let him in, my heart pounding as he walked past me into the kitchen. We sat on the couch, the wine bottle half empty on the coffee table between us. The TV was on, but neither of us was really paying attention. Andrew leaned back, his arm draped casually over the back of the couch, his gaze fixed on me. "You've been quiet," he said. "I've been thinking," I replied, though the truth was I'd been trying not to think at all. "About what?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. I hesitated, my fingers twisting in my lap. "About us," I admitted finally. His expression didn't change, but I saw the faintest flicker of something in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or hope. And I don't know what to do," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Andrew shifted closer, his arm brushing against mine. "You don't have to do anything," he said softly. "Just let this be what it is." "And what is it?" I asked, turning to look at him. "It's real," he said simply. The honesty in his voice made my chest tighten, and before I could stop myself, I reached for his hand. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his fingers curling around mine. "But you don't have to be." The air between us grew heavier, the silence stretching as we sat there, neither of us willing to break the moment. Then, without thinking, I leaned toward him. It wasn't planned or deliberate, it was instinct, a pull I couldn't resist. When our lips met, it was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both afraid of what might happen if we gave in completely. But then Andrew's hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and the kiss deepened, growing more urgent. His other hand rested on my waist, steadying me as I moved closer, my hands gripping his shirt as if to anchor myself. Every rational thought vanished, replaced by the overwhelming heat of his touch and the dizzying sensation of being wanted in a way I hadn't felt in so long. Somehow, we ended up in my bedroom. I couldn't remember how we got there, only the way his hands moved over me with a reverence that made my heart ache. He paused, his forehead resting against mine as he whispered, "Are you sure?" "Yes," I breathed, my voice trembling but certain. The next moments blurred into a haze of warmth and connection, every kiss and touch weaving a story of its own. Andrew was gentle but insistent, his hands and lips exploring with a care that left me breathless. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. Afterward, we lay tangled together beneath the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Andrew's arm was draped over me, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, my head resting against his chest. "Better than okay," I said, though my voice wavered with the weight of what had just happened. He pressed a kiss to my temple, his hold on me tightening. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "This is real, Evelyn. I'm not going anywhere." As comforting as his words were, the reality of what we'd done began to settle over me. The weight of it pressed down on me, making it harder to breathe. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to figure it out right now," he said, his hand brushing against my cheek. "We'll take it one step at a time." His reassurance eased some of the tension in my chest, but the questions swirling in my mind refused to quiet. What would people say if they found out? What would happen if this all fell apart? And yet, despite the fear, there was something else, a flicker of hope that made it impossible to regret what had happened. When morning came, the sunlight streaming through the curtains felt brighter than usual. Andrew stirred beside me, his arm tightening around my waist as he pulled me closer. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, though my voice trembled slightly. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "You okay?" "I think so," I said, though the truth was far more complicated than I could put into words. After Andrew left that morning, I stood in the quiet of the house, the memory of his touch still lingering on my skin. The house felt different now, both emptier and fuller all at once. I knew we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the weight of that realization was almost suffocating. But beneath the fear and doubt, there was something else. Something wonderful. The morning after Andrew left, the house felt unnervingly still. I moved through my routine on autopilot, making coffee, tidying up, and trying to ignore the lingering scent of his cologne on the pillow beside mine. I told myself I needed to think, to make sense of everything that had happened. But every time I tried to focus, my mind returned to the way he'd held me, the way he'd whispered my name like it was something sacred. By mid-afternoon, I had nearly convinced myself that putting distance between us would be the right thing to do. I had spent years carefully maintaining the balance of my life, keeping my emotions neatly contained. Letting Andrew in threatened to unravel all of that. But as I stared out the kitchen window, watching the wind sway the branches of the oak tree in the yard, my phone buzzed on the counter. "Andrew, are you okay?" A simple question. One that carried so much weight. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing a reply. "Me? I don't know." That evening, Andrew showed up unannounced. I opened the door to find him standing there, his expression a mix of hope and worry. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. We moved to the living room, the tension between us palpable. Andrew sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees as he watched me. "I've been thinking about us," he said after a moment, his voice steady but quiet. "And?" I asked, my chest tightening. "I don't regret what happened," he said firmly. "Not a single moment of it." His words sent a jolt through me, and I sank into the armchair across from him. "Andrew, this isn't just about us," I said, my voice trembling. "There are so many things to consider. What would people think? What would they say?" "Why does it matter what they think?" he countered, his tone laced with frustration. "This is our life, Evelyn, not theirs." His certainty both comforted and terrified me. I looked away, my fingers twisting in my lap. "It's not that simple," I whispered. "Maybe it can be," he said, leaning forward. "If we let it be." I met his gaze, and the intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. "What if this doesn't work?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "What if it does?" he replied, his voice soft but insistent. "What if this is exactly what we both need?" The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over us. Andrew stood, crossing the space between us in a few quick steps. He knelt in front of me, his hands covering mine. "I know you're scared," he said gently, "but you don't have to face this alone. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." His words broke through the walls I'd spent years building, and tears filled my eyes. "I don't want to lose you," I admitted, my voice cracking. "You won't," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Before I could second-guess myself, I leaned forward, wrapping my arms around him. He held me tightly, his hands stroking my back as I buried my face in his shoulder. For the first time in years, I let myself feel everything. The fear, the doubt, the longing, and the undeniable pull toward him. When I finally pulled back, Andrew cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on my cheeks. "I'm all in, Evelyn," he said softly, "but I need to know if you are too." Instead of answering, I kissed him. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, growing more urgent as the weight of our emotions spilled over. Andrew lifted me effortlessly, carrying me to the couch as his lips never left mine. Every touch, every kiss felt like a reassurance, a reminder that we weren't alone, that we didn't have to carry the weight of our doubts and fears by ourselves. The hours that followed were a blur of warmth and connection. Andrew was patient, his hands gentle as he explored every inch of me, his lips murmuring soft reassurances that made my chest ache with something that felt dangerously close to hope. For the first time in years, I let myself believe that I deserved this, that I deserved him. Later, as we lay tangled together on the couch, the room bathed in the soft glow of the table lamp, I felt a strange mix of peace and unease. Andrew's arm was draped over my shoulders, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, though my thoughts were a whirlwind. "I think so," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to figure everything out right now," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "We'll take it one step at a time." His reassurance eased some of the tension in my chest, but the reality of our situation was impossible to ignore. The next morning, Andrew stayed for breakfast. We sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and sharing quiet smiles. It felt almost normal, like any other day. But as he left, pressing a lingering kiss to my forehead before walking out the door, the weight of what we'd done began to settle over me. What if someone found out? What would they say? And yet, beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was something else. Something I couldn't quite name but knew I didn't want to lose. That afternoon, Andrew sent me a message. "Andrew, I know this isn't easy, but I'm here. Always." I stared at the message for a long time before typing a reply. I know, thank you." As I hit send, I felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, we could make this work. The following days were a blur of quiet reflection and whispered moments between Andrew and me. He didn't push me, but his presence was constant, a steady reminder of the connection we had forged and the risks it carried. I spent hours pacing through the house, running my fingers along the familiar furniture, the framed photos on the walls, the little reminders of the life I had built here. It all felt like a tether, holding me back from stepping fully into this new chapter, yet also grounding me in a way I couldn't ignore. When I thought of Andrew, my chest filled with a mixture of warmth and fear. He had given me a glimpse of something I hadn't felt in years: freedom, joy, and the terrifying possibility of being truly seen. But the weight of what others might think, of what this relationship could cost us, lingered like a shadow over every moment of happiness. One evening, I sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The wineglass in my hand was half empty, and my thoughts swirled like the liquid in the glass. I didn't hear Andrew approach until he was standing in front of me, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Mind if I join you?" he asked softly. I nodded, and he sat down beside me, the swing creaking slightly under our combined weight. For a moment we didn't speak, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. "I've been thinking," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "About what?" he asked, turning to look at me. "About us," I admitted, my fingers tightening around the stem of the glass. Andrew nodded, his expression steady. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this," I said, my voice trembling. He reached for my hand, his fingers warm and steady against mine. "You are," he said firmly. "You're stronger than you think." I looked at him, my chest tightening at the certainty in his eyes. "What if people find out? What if they don't understand?" "They don't have to understand," he said softly. "This isn't about them, it's about us." His words settled over me like a balm, easing some of the tension in my chest. But the doubts still lingered, stubborn and unyielding. "What if this doesn't work?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "What if it does?" he replied, his tone filled with quiet hope. The simplicity of his answer caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, I let myself lean into him, resting my head on his shoulder as the swing rocked gently beneath us. We sat like that for a long time, the sky darkening around us as the stars began to emerge. Andrew's hand remained steady on mine, his thumb brushing slow, soothing circles against my skin. "You don't have to decide everything tonight," he said finally, his voice low and soothing. "But I need you to know that I'm all in, Evelyn. Whatever it takes, I'm here." His words broke something inside me and tears filled my eyes. "I'm scared," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I know," he said, pulling me closer. "But you're not alone." The next morning, I woke with a strange sense of clarity. The doubts were still there, but they no longer felt insurmountable. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a choice. A real, honest choice about what I wanted my life to be. As I stood by the window, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, I realized that my fear wasn't about Andrew or what we had. It was about stepping into the unknown, about risking my carefully constructed world for the chance at something greater. And for the first time, I felt ready to take that step. When Andrew came over that evening, I met him at the door, my heart pounding as I pulled him inside. "Hi," he said softly, his hand brushing against mine. "Hi," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. We moved to the living room and Andrew sat on the couch, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. "What's on your mind?" he asked. I took a deep breath, sitting down beside him. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I said. And I don't want to live my life being afraid of what other people might think," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "I want to be happy. And you make me happy, Andrew." Relief washed over his face, and he reached for my hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "You make me happy too," he said softly. We sat together for a long time, the weight of the moment settling over us. It wasn't a perfect solution. There were still questions to answer, challenges to face, but for the first time, I felt like we could face them together. As the night stretched on, I let myself lean into the hope that had been quietly growing inside me. The future was uncertain, but it was ours to shape, one step at a time.